This is the first of a series of mini lectures on the topic of Freud's interpretation of dreams. I've given it the title, How Dreams Think, and why I've given it that subtitle will become clear. In fact, best way of understanding why I want to prioritize how dreams think is by referring to Freud's interpretation of dreams, and there's a particular quote that I would like us to use as our anchoring point through this series of talks on Freud's interpretation of dreams. This is the quote that I like. You'll see it up here. At bottom, says Freud, dreams are nothing other than a particular form of thinking that's made possible by the state of sleep. It is the dream work which creates that form, and it alone is the essence of dreaming. Now that may start to make some sense of why I have, in some previous lectures, tried to focus on the unconscious as a kind of processing, the unconscious as a kind of thinking, or even, as it's sometimes thought in Lacanian circles, the unconscious as a kind of interpreting. This quote, I think, is very suggestive and a helpful way to doing an interesting, provocative, original revisiting of Freud. Because if we look at this and take him seriously, in a sense what he's saying is that dreams are a form of thinking, they're a form of processing, they're a form of doing something. So instead of the perennial traditional focus, oh, let's read Freud's interpretation of dreams because then we'll be able to interpret our dreams. In that focus, the interpretation seems to be the thing to really prioritize. And we get hooked on the objective of trying to find that, oh, that's the meaning, that's the underlying meaning of the dream. Now, of course, psychoanalysis wouldn't be psychoanalysis if there was no interpretation involved. But from this standpoint, what seems to me to be particularly interesting is that dreams are doing something. They're a form of thinking, they're a form of processing. And that's what I want us to focus on. What are they doing? Not so much to get hooked on the idea of, oh, we finally absolutely definitively interpreted a dream. And you could say that Freud is sometimes guilty of that kind of temptation. But to think about if we were using dreams in a clinical domain, it would be maybe to throw it back to the person to try to get a sense for them of how their dreams are trying to do something, how their dreams are thinking, and what those thoughts might be. So that's our kind of focus here. You may also then start to see how this Freudian work that we're going to do to try and understand exactly what this dream work is, because he's just told us dream work is, as it were, the name for this, the key to this thinking process that happens in dreams. The Lacanian connection here is, Lacan has this difficult statement, this formidable, tricky idea that the unconscious is structured like a language. That seems a little difficult to grasp at first glance, but you could say that Freud's idea that dreams themselves are a form of thinking, and Freud's notion of the dream work, which will give us 4 crucial operations for how dreams do their thinking. Once we understand that, then we understand what Lacan means when he says that the unconscious is structured by a language. What he means is that there's a series of fundamental processes, or you could say operations. And we're going to spend a little bit of time making sure we understand exactly what they are. Just to key you into what they're going to be, and this will be the focus of the subsequent lectures in this little series, there's condensation, symbolism, displacement, and representability. We're going to spend a fair amount of work making sure that these are not just jargonistic technical terms, but that we can use them, that we have a good intuitive grasp of how these processes work. Each of these processes is, for Freud, a kind of disguise. It's a way of treating material. But you could also say that each of them has their operation, or their operation works within language itself. And I'll give some examples of that. You'll note that I've said here that Freud's dream theory will teach us about the primary process. That is, about the unconscious, how the unconscious processes material or thinks. This is a type of thinking which goes on outside of our conscious control. Another way of framing that is to say the reason we're starting by looking at Freud's theory of dreams is because dreams use a series of operations in order to think, in order to process material, in order to do something. And those fundamental operations, disguise mechanisms, ways of treating material. Those are the fundamental operations of the unconscious more generally. So you could say, whether we're doing this material as a way to introduce ourselves to Freudian thinking, the Freudian notion of the unconscious, this is the kind of basic matrix, the key concepts we want to be able to grasp if we want to understand what Freud means by the primary process. By the same token, these are the key principles, the key concepts we need to grasp if we're going to understand what Lacan has in mind by his idea that the unconscious is structured like a language. So what we're going to do now is just briefly introduce some of these concepts, and then I'm going to give you a task, a challenge, a kind of homework exercise to think a little bit about. So we'll do a little bit of this theory first, and then the homework exercise at the end. Okay, so what we've said is that there's these four operations, these four ways of treating material, these four disguises. I'm going to describe them very briefly, but first we could say, why are they even necessary? Well, one of the reasons that they're necessary, says Freud, is that to be a human being is to be characterized by a certain set of desires and wishes and wants. When Freud's talking about this situation, and you could say this is the kind of ground spring, the very underpinning of human subjectivity at some level for Freud, is that to be a human entity is to be someone who seems almost constitutively unsatisfied. You get something, you're a little bit happy, but then you start to want something else. He seems to think that this, what underlies human subjectivity, is a kind of wishfulness, a kind of wanting. And when he starts his very large research project on dreams, and he starts collecting dreams, he records his own, he asks people for their dreams, he finds dreams in literature, he gets dreams from the people who come to see him in his clinic. He starts to collect all the dreams, and he is kind of drowning in this massive amount of material, and he's battling, he's struggling, he's trying to say, what's the common denominator? What do all dreams have in common? And we will come up with a series of suggested answers to that question. But one of the features that he thinks all dreams share is that dreams are mental operations that happen during the time of sleep, and he thinks that within every single dream you can find something like a wish, something like a desiring for, something like a picturing, a wanting. Now, of course, this is also, in a way, a philosophical postulate. We could say maybe this is where we got to decide whether we're going to agree with facets of psychoanalysis or not. So the question then for you is, do you think that this is a good way to approach human subjectivity? Is human subjectivity something that is conditioned by, qualified by, very much about a type of wishing, desiring, wanting for beyond what one has? Let's give one little theoretical example of this idea before we move back to doing this. At one point in the interpretation of dreams, Freud has a little bit of, you could call it, developmental psychological speculation. And his question is, what happens to the infant when the infant is confronted with some experience of frustration? The infant, say, for example, is very thirsty, very hungry. They really need to eat, they really want to eat. What do? That's right, they say, yo, Mom, I'm really hungry and thirsty. Well, no, they don't do that because they don't yet have language, right? So they're not going to be able to do that. So they will maybe cry, they'll maybe make some kind of noise, and hopefully that will get them what they need. But of course, the world being what it is, that's not always going to happen. Even the world's most perfect caregiver, mom, dad, whatever, isn't going to be able to attend to the child at every single moment of the day. So almost by definition, there's going to be some frustration, which leads us to suggest then that maybe it's not just that what underlies human subjectivity for Freud is the desire for something, the wanting for something, but you could say it's how one responds to the frustrations that inevitably arise in human existence. But nevertheless, let's stay with the example. Sometimes no one comes when I'm crying. Sometimes no one heeds my call. What do? Freud's answer is that sometimes he thinks the child is frustrated, the child wants something, and maybe they fall asleep, but maybe they visualize the thing. Maybe they call the thing to mind. Maybe they don't have to consciously call it to mind, but they just start to see that image. In other words, in the absence of being able to get something that I need, in the absence of being able to get the food item, the thing I'm wishing for, what do? My mind responds by picturing it, by imaging it, you could say. Freud wonders, is this a very primal, primitive, early, elementary way of dealing with frustrations in the world? And I think it's a wonderful line of speculation, because you could say that even though we are no longer infants, we resort to the same kind of thing. Now, you could find lots of different examples. One example I like is an old TV show called Survivor. May still be on. It must have been 10, 15 years that I watched it. But at the end of the one series of Survivor, all these guys who get thrown into the Australian outback, all these survival trials that they're put through, members of the teams, like a reality show, get progressively eliminated until there's 3 or 4 of them. And of course, they don't have food, they've got to survive, it's called Survivor. And they're sitting on a rock and they're lying there and they're kind of, oh gosh, I'm so hungry. And the one guy says, oh, I'm thinking of roast beef. And the other guy's like, oh man, for me it's a tuna sandwich or whatever. And I thought this was kind of interesting because they are needing, wanting, desperate for something. They can't get it, so they visualize it. We could find lots of other examples of this. For me, my own private little example is that sometimes when I have lost something, which unfortunately happens more often than I'd like, I sometimes, but I can picture it so clearly. It's like I want it, I'm trying to find it, reality is not cooperating, but an image comes to mind. And of course, maybe you can see where this is going. This is psychoanalysis. We often think about sexual contents in psychoanalysis, and you could say, well, isn't imagining of certain images also part of the sexual process? There's something I can't have, there's something that I'm wishing for, I picture it. We could give more examples, but the reason I'm giving this idea here is that if Freud is right, a very elementary, primary way of trying to get something when I can't have it, or when I'm frustrated, or when I'm wishing for it, is to picture it. And if that's an elementary aspect of human psychology, you could say that is also what underlies the processes of dreams. Dreams seem to be very much about the picturing of something that I haven't got, or that I'm interested in, or that I want to have. I picture them. All of this little tangent that I'm giving now is as a way of saying, why do we need disguises in dreams? We've made 2 steps in our argument. We've said that human beings seem to desire, they seem to want something that they haven't got. They're always kind of leaning towards, grabbing for the thing they don't have, whether it's more money, more fame, more this, more whatever. It seems to be an elementary aspect of human subjectivity. That's the first step of the argument. The second is to say, well, how do we deal with these things and the frustrations that we confront in everyday reality? Freud's answer is, you picture them. Great. This then seems to give a very strong argument for the visual form of dreams, the image form of dreams. Remember, the idea here being that it's a very primal, elementary way of dealing with frustrations and desires, is to picture the thing we want. The next step in the argument, though, is, what if we don't always know what we want? Or, moreover, what if some of what we want isn't particularly palatable to our conscious minds? If that's the case, then if we are about to picture and wish for things that might cause us some guilt or might cause us some conflict, we need for them to be disguised. If we need for them to be disguised, that means that we also need to, for Freud, if we're going to interpret dreams, know how those disguises work. And that's where we're going to pick up in our next lecture. The homework exercise is a simple one. To try and record a dream, even if it's just a few sentences. Any dream, perhaps it's a recent one, perhaps it's a dream you're going to have tonight. Write it down and see if anywhere there is something like the possibility of a wish. And we'll start with that in the next talk.